Welcome to Art Indica with Dr. Alka Pandey and Nidesh. We are talking about 500 years of Mughals in India. And the first episode, we have titled it The Empire of the Senses. So, Dr. Pandey, this is like, we should like try to paraphrase this 500 years of Mughals because there's such a big legacy around what they have done, and it's everywhere. It's art, the buildings, the city planning, and the architecture. And if you can like do a umbrella kind of a paraphrase, and then we can move into.
Well, when you think of the Mughals, for me, the first thing is you think of beauty. And I like the way you've called it the empire of the senses. Because I think with the Mughals, it was all the five senses, what we call hamari pancho indriyan. We were kind of consumed with it when we look at this beautiful medieval period from 1526 to about 1858, 59. And what you see in these 500 years or more than 300 years, which I look at, of the Mughals is the affluence, the richness, the grandeur, the spectacle, which comes from a fakir on the road to the Jahapana who's seated on his peacock throne. So look at the gamut of people that we see. A wayside fakir who is sitting, to whom Jahangir wants to go and meet, in a cave in Ujjain, to Shah Jahan, regal, to Nur Jahan, whose, I think, mother created the rose, Itra. So look at the fragrances which come. Look at the pulaus which come. Look at the clothing which comes. Look at the buildings which come. And I think Mughal period covered almost every aspect of life, from the way they brought in politics, the way they brought in a different kind of landscapes with their charbags, the syncretic culture which we today really value in North India in particular, which is the Ganga Jamni culture. This all came from what we call the Mughals. Of course, you go back to the Indo-Islamic, you go back to the Delhi Sultans, the Sultanate period, you even go back to the slave dynasty. You go back to Iltutmish, you go back to Balban. But you see, those were stepping stones. You go back to the Arab invasion of Sindh in the 8th century. So you've had these moments of Islamic culture in India, but it was the Mughals who really came here to stay, Humayun onwards, and made India their home and brought in a culture which was alien. But I will also give a lot of credit to India, to our beautiful land, which always assimilated, transformed, and then, gave birth to something new, which stayed, which grew in this fecund soil, which is India.
They were also the kind of, in their own times, they became the biggest probably empire in the world that time, with the biggest might and prosperity. So, and they knew about it in those times. So, the kind of buildings they also keep changing from the brick red to the whites, and suddenly the shelter of the world we were talking about, Jahapana, which will translate as shelter of the world in English, as Salman Rushdie did it in his book Enchantress of Florence. So clearly that, so, and then showing it in each bit of it. One is interacting with the world, because you can see lots of art from the world was starting to come towards India and get influenced by it, and also creating their own intellectual properties in terms of, when we see Red Fort and when we see Taj Mahal and when we see Humayun's tomb. But when all of these buildings are like signature buildings, even Fatehpur Sikri, to my mind, I mean to say, it was a great city which was not to be, but in a way, it's a great attempt in architecture or city planning.
I'll take off from Fatehpur Sikri because it's one of my favorite places to go. A city which failed because of a bad water system, I presume. But if you look at Fatehpur, it is actually what for me symbolizes the Mughal thought. There is a Turkish princess, there is a Christian princess, there is a Hindu princess, there is Nizamuddin Aulia. You have everybody in Fatehpur. So the syncretic culture of Fatehpur symbolizes the high point of the Akbari period. But when I think of the Mughals, I think of Babur, the very, very ambitious Babur, who at 11 years of age wanted Samarkand. He never got it. They chucked him out. He came to India and crushed the army of Ibrahim Lodi because his cousin Daulat Khan Lodi invited him. And he came here and stayed. But all the time he was dreaming of Fargana. In his memoirs he writes, in the Baburnama it is written, I dream of the muskmelons of Fargana. So as a young child, I actually wondered what these muskmelons were. Because I read about Babur dreaming of the muskmelons of Fargana. He tried to recreate a Samarkand in India. And it was nostalgia for him. He died a man dreaming of Samarkand and his Uzbeki ancestors. But it was his son, actually, who dug and dived deep into India, even though he lost his throne and went off to the court of Shah Mast. But he always wanted to come back to India. He came back to India with the Mir Ali brothers. He came back with, I'm forgetting the number, but he came back with, I think, 50 plus painters from the court of Persia. He came back with carpets from Persia. He came back with images of the greatest empire of the world at that time, Persia. And then in his court, he didn't have too much time with, once he came back, he died earlier than it was thought of. But having said that, his Begum, Haji Begum, who commissioned the mausoleum, which today we call Humayun's tomb, and all of us who live in Delhi, we go to Humayun's tomb, and today it's become a great site with Sundar Nursery there and a museum there. But it was the first mausoleum with a garden. So you had the charbals, you had the onion-sized dome there, and it was in some ways the precursor to the Taj Mahal. His son completed it. And his son, of course, we all think of Jodha Akbar, this great film which was done. But somehow I love our Indian cinema too. It brings alive the grandeur through the love story of Jodha and Akbar. Of course, it's romanticized. And Akbar had so many wives. He had so many, in fact, Abdur Rahim Khan becomes his stepson because he marries the mother. All dynastic marriages, but then Ashutosh Goatrikar immortalizes the love of Hrithik Roshan and Aishwarya Rai, and you think of all the little Krishna that she brings into the household, which leads to Akbar establishing a new religion called the Deen-e-Ilahi. So these things become very important for me when I start thinking of the Mughals, and I start thinking of how the Mughals, or the Mongols as they were called, and in that Persian-Turki language, they became Mughals for us.
Yeah.
And we see how they brought in the Central Asian, how they brought in the Persian, and how they, with Humayun, setting up an atelier of a new style of painting. And later, as we go along, we'll also see how this painting changes from Humayun, where it's for Persian, to Akbar's atelier, because Akbar was also taught in one of these ateliers, to Jahangir, where he begins portraiture, very much like Roman portraiture, where kings are shown growing older. The famous portrait of Inayat Khan, which he commissions to show a dying Inayat Khan. Of course, we'll talk later, as you said, of the Tuladan, which the painting you wanted to talk about. But also then we see the Shah Jahani period, where it was Darbar art. And then we come to the more austere period in Aurangzeb's youth.
Jodha Akbar is a very recent kind of a film, but we had this famous Mughal-e-Azam, and in my childhood, there were people used to give those LP records and play the dialogues of it, and they were like, and you can actually sense how much of opulence and luxury and power the Mughal, and basically it's a film about between Akbar and Jahangir. Dilip Kumar as Jahangir and Prithviraj Kapoor as Akbar, and how it kind of plays on and in our collective memory. So it's Mughal-e-Azam is probably very signature. It also shows the whole the big ticket luxury thing which they brought to.
Yeah, because I really like I think the casting was also great, though. Prithviraj, Redolent, Akbar.
The music, dance, dialogues, everything was like phenomenal in that.
Yeah.
And that film is still, I think, an enigma. I mean, if people will talk about the 5 or 10 or 3 best films from Bollywood, I think it is still factor in them.
And it also talks of parental power at that point. It also talked of the fact that, kingship was very important for them, because they thought they were divine kings. They thought they were the gods' creatures on earth. So Prithviraj as Akbar makes sure that his son cannot be with a dancing girl like Anarkali.
So one of these things is about the whole luxury of thought. It's like, it was not just that, just the opulence of it. They were also like able to think and imagine and, create that kind of the whole facades of sorts, and even in like small forms to the big ones. So that is the other bit thing about, to show to the world that we are the supremely rich.
So I think, as William Dalrymple reiterates time and again in his last Mughal, that India at that period controlled 25% of the world's GDP. It was the richest economy in the world. And that is why, after Shah Jahan did the Taj Mahal and the Peacock Throne, there was still lots of money to spare. And this was, in many ways, why do you think Sir Thomas Roe came and presented his creations to India? In fact, the Mughals really thought that they were uncultured and uncouth, and whatever gifts which were presented to Jahangir, they were cleaned before they were presented, when they were presented by the Europeans, because they found them to be really uncultured, unlettered, even the clothes, because I'm forgetting where it says, I think it was Audrey Trushkill's book, which she writes in The Mughals, that there were 3 reasons why they were not light. One, they didn't use water to clean the things from the human body. 2, they did not understand. Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
In that film, if you remember, Junoon, they say, kagaz istemal karte hain. So there were 3 things which they were not thought worthy of, and one of them, this is the most important. And luxury, of course, for them was actually a way of life. When I look back to the ancient period of our history, we look at celebrating the sensual. We look at celebrating karma. We look at celebrating the Purusharths of life. But with the Mughals, it was luxury they celebrated. For them, being luxurious in every way, refinement and taste. You look at the safas they wore, you look at the kamarbands they wore, you look at the chakdar jamas they wore, look at the costuming they wore, look at the poetry, look at the dances, look at the music they created, look at the mansabdari system they created. Even for getting revenue, everything was thought with deep thinking, a refinement of ideas. And all the rulers, if you see, whether it was the dyslexic Akbar, the non-educated Akbar here, but look where he went, what he created, the systems of administration the Mughals created. Look at the Navratans they had. Look at the addict, as he's called, Jahangir, whose lips were red because of the wine he imbibed. But look at the goblets which they had. Look at the way they drank. Even if he was having opium, there was a certain way of indulging in that. So you see, there was a kind of luxury of action, luxury of thought, luxury of administration, luxury of even fratricide, because they were all kidding their brothers to come to the throne. It was all done in a manner which was extremely well thought out. I mean, how Aurangzeb fooled his brother Murad by inebriating him over wine and then killing him. So look at the way they, when you talk of luxury, and then look at the jewelry the men wore. And for example, when Akbar got to know about the birth of Shah Jahan, the way he took off his, you see it in the movies.
Yeah.
So the pearls, the emeralds, the Kohinoor from the Golconda mines, look at the luxury we have in our country. Even today, we have back Kinkhwab, the brocades. Where did they all come from? From the Mughal period. I often think of Babur all the time, reminiscing over the fragrance that he misses. And I think of the fragrance which the Mughals brought to India in every way, the luxury. It's absolutely admirable.
So one of the things which also happened with them was that they were I think, one big legacy which made India their home. There's not much of them left in the places where they came from, but at the same time they kind of created these things at that level, which in North India was probably not there till then, probably, or was it?
See, they were the original Muslims. I was seeing a podcast, I'm forgetting which one, where a gentleman from JNU said, "Hum to sab converted hai. We're all converts here. We are not the original Muslims." But they were the original Muslims, right? And they, all of them, strangely had a lot of religious tolerances. There was no fundamentalism the way we perceive of it now. So it was a very interesting thing which I'm reading, that all these rulers, all the Mughals, and even if you go back to the ancestry of Babur, to Genghis Khan, to Taimur, and you start looking at their history, you will always see there was a great deal of religious tolerance with them and a mutual respect of the other. So even the abolition of jizya, which was done later. So I think in many ways they are also mal-understood rather than even misunderstood. And I think it is our lack of knowledge which makes them or turns our conquerors into barbaric people. They were not barbaric, they were very refined. And as we were talking earlier, they came with a lot of refinement of taste in every way.
So 500 years later, how do we remember them as, in terms of their contribution in art, architecture, and design to India?
So when we talk of art, architecture, and design, I would put them at top of the pyramid. Look at the beautiful piedura which is done at the Taj Mahal. You will not find that kind of piedura anywhere in the world, not even in Moorish architecture in Spain. Look at the calligraphy. Wherever you see the calligraphy, look at the way Bahadur Shah Zafar wrote his poetry in beautiful Persian. They were the ones who introduced Urdu, the language. It was not later. Persian was the language of the Darbar, but Urdu was the language of the people, which they brought in. And the sher, shairi, ghazals, which were all brought in, the refinement of thought, and even of the courtesans. If you see, even in The Suitable Boy, if you see the earlier episodes, where was the young suitable boy sent? To the homes of the courtesans to learn how to behave with a woman. Tehzeeb and adab, they were all taught there. So when you look at art, architecture and design, look at the itar dance they had, the pandans they had, the songs, the thumri, the khayal. Kahan se aaya? The khayal Raiki started with the Mughals, right? And even the poetry which Abdul Rahim wrote, he wrote in Rijbasha.
Yeah.
So how do you look at them? I look at them as the greatest patron saints of the maestros of art, architecture, design and painting. Look at the Anwar-e Suheli, the Tuti Nama, the Razmanama, the Pacha Namas. They were great recorders of history also. So when we look at historical narrative, you see it the way they have patronized, whether it was Daswant, whether it was the court painters, the way the rulers actually talked and conversed with their painters. And even in some ways enrich their art with their own inputs, because they were all qualified people themselves.
True. Talk about this painting, especially Jahangir weighing Prince Khurram in gold. This is more of a Hindi ritual called Tuladan. And so this is more of a Hindu ritual, and Mughal emperor is shown doing that. And he's getting it painted as well, just more of a documentation and a matter of record. So what are we seeing here? What is happening here?
Now, if you look at this painting, I'm just going to show it, but of course, you'll be showing them. But I just thought that we could discuss it a little bit, and that's why I got this little printout with us. Look at the composition, how much it has changed since the paintings of the Jain miniatures, because that was this thing to the Laura Chanda and the Chora Panchisika. Here you see, and it's not even Persian. It has a distinct Mughal tone to it. You see the Persian carpet at the back. You see them wearing, there is a syncretic culture. You see a Hindu man wearing a Angavastra, but with transparent drapes. You see Jahangir with his kamarband and his chagdar jama and his diaphanous skirt here. You see the jewels, you see the young Shah Jahan sitting, and you see his attendants. Look at the jewels and the beauty. Look at the affluence which is here, and you look at the weighing scales. But the canopy is very, very simple. It's not over decorated that you see in later and earlier. And look at the calligraphy on the top. Beautifully done. So for me, this painting also shows a coming together of both Hindu and Muslim ideas, which was so prevalent at that period. Because Shah Jahan is almost 3/4 Rajput. Yeah. So you see all this coming in, and you see the dancers below. You see a beautiful spectacle which is happening in this image, and you are actually drawn to the image. You have a very, very Islamic kind of non-figurative work at the back, which becomes a precursor to the Taj Mahal, what you see outside in the facade. So here you see a beautiful interplay of traditions, and you see the love of the father towards the son. You can also see some expressions. I almost see as if Jahangir and Shah Jahan are having a conversation here. They are speaking with their eyes, and there is a very, very close bond between the father and the son, and the courtier standing right here. So for me, this painting becomes very symptomatic of the period, of the relationship, and also of beauty which is seen in this painting. And of course, luxury, which we talk about.
So how this transition happened? I mean, how they were like in the beginning they came as outsiders, and then they kind of became as Indian as others would be. Also in this painting, this whole uniting about the when we see our children, everybody gets to unite, and because these children are also not just coming from they are like Mughal fathers, but then the mothers have been Rajputs and other religions and locals as well, from native places as well. So for the children, probably we big unite. But then how this transition came about? I mean, in terms of aesthetic, I mean, how how did that happen?
I think, it was a very gradual process, Videsh, because see, Babur died within 4 years, and he died nostalgia, blah, blah. With Humayun, he had decided to make it his home, and he dug his heels deep into India. I think it was with Akbar that the total, I won't even say transition, it became their home. He married many Rajput princesses. He probably started even enjoying Indian food. He started, using, asking artists to illustrate the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So look at the way his mind was changing. And then the building of Fatehpur. That whole Buland Darwaza, which was his victory over Gujarat. So him going into the interiors, invading more and more of India, making Agra becoming his capital, started building buildings for, like his son built Sikandra in Agra. So what you see there is that these are people now, they are no longer immigrants or diaspora or people who are trying to find a homeland. They found their homeland.
They become the settlers now, and then now
they are the settlers. Now they are the rulers.
And now
they are the conquerors.
And there's no temporariness to it. There's a decisive finality to it, that we are going to be here now, and therefore they
no, we are Hum Hindustani.
And then the whole flaunt, and now they also know that they are the supremely, the richest and the mightiest in the world. So that is also showing now in that way.
So I just wanted to also add to it and say that, for the Mughals, luxury was not about just spending money. It was politics, theology, and they used branding. They used a lot of branding. The emperor had to look at the center of the universe because he was Jahanpana. And the logic of the emperor was Zile Ilahi, shadow of God. So his body, court, and possessions had to reflect paradise. And in the paradise, there was gold, there was jewels, and perfumes. The men wore perfumes. Uh, all the Itaris as they are, you will see them in Allahabad. You see them in Lucknow.
Kannauj.
Yes, of course. Kannauj is a heartland of Itra. Then there was also the great theatre of power. For example, a Mansabdar saw his emperor only once a year. And God convinced him to be so loyal. The power and the might. The peacock throne just 100 meters away. And of course, the scent of ambergris. You know, for them, it was like the spit of the whale, which is so important for every perfume. So, therefore, they were like whales. And as they said, that Shah Jahan spent 1 billion on the Taj Mahal and still had cash left for the peacock throne. So, what you also see, the textiles which were worn at that time, the kimkhwa, cashmere. You were talking of cashmere earlier. So, the cashmere was also innovation and invention of the Mughals. And look at the sarpages they wore. The emeralds the size of plums with dangling pearl earrings, they were worn only by the emperor. And armor and armor, they loved jade. The Mughals loved jade and they had crystal and hard stone. They were obsessed with jade. They imported it from Kashgar and carved it in Agra. So you see the wine cups which they made, we were talking of that, the way they drank wine, and you could see some of the Anarkali, they said you could see the wine. Her skin was so beautiful that you could see the wine going there. And Shah Jahan's cup, which is at the VNDA right now, was 7 meters wide, but when you took it to the light, it still glowed. The hookah bases. Look at the hookah bases. They used jade there, not metal as it is used today. And in the Taj Mahal, as I was saying, they used 28 stones in their tetrajuda. From lapis lazuli, from Afghanistan, to carnelian from Gujarat, and malachite from Russia. So it was, again, with, as I told you, Noor Jahan and her mother, when they made this Itre Jahangiri by capturing rose oil that floated on canal water. And Jahangir was recorded to eating mangoes from all over India, even though mangoes are still known in Pakistan and they say lovely mangoes from there. But look at the mangoes in India, from the Kesar to the Anarkali of Andhra. There are mangoes grown throughout.
Each geography has their different mangoes in Iran, and even that was like celebrated hugely by the Mughals for their their favorite indulgence during the summers. Basically.
Yes, they would have mango parties. And therefore, with where were the mango parties? In their gardens. And they created the most beautiful gardens. Like Jahangir and his wife created the Shalimar Gardens in Kashmir. You had the Nishad Bagh. You had Pinjore Gardens near Chandigarh. Look at the lovely pavilions they had. And for them, the gardens was paradise on earth. Paradise on earth. They used to say that is one of the things written in the Red Fort here. Jannah, I'm forgetting the Persian thing. If it is here, paradise is here, it's here, it's here. And how luxury trickled down to their Mansabdars as well. It was unfortunate that Aurangzeb was so austere. He was a fabulous calligrapher, but he brought down the luxury. His Bivi Ka Maqbara, which he created, was a real coming down from the Taj Mahal, though he used the same white stone, marble. And I think you were and we were talking earlier, you wrote beautifully about the fact that how they had fragility of paper and the permanence of stone. So this is what the Mughals did. Fragility of thought, fragility of ideas, how you see the fragility of paper, because the manuscripts that they created, which was of this beautiful paper, where they used gold and silver and embellished it, where the borders was as important as the painting inside. So these were very, very beautiful
The Jali in the
jarokas and jalis which they had. So what you see is that there was decades of accumulated wealth, and it was so sad that Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal ruler, had to pawn his jewels to pay his poets because he loved poetry so much.
one is like think about it and also execute. This whole scale, the dimension, the centrality of it, and also as it's so refined actually.
So first thing for me, Nidish, was the color palette changed. If you see, the Indian colors, when I'm looking here only as an art historian, looking at imagery, and there was a big divide between the North and the South, because South was more Persian in India, the Deccani rulers were more Persian, and North, they were more the Central Asia. The Indian colors were haldi, red, and black, green. Of course, I'm not talking of the Jain miniatures because they also had that blue there. But if you look at the Mughals, they brought in a lot of course, there were reds and yellows, but they brought in blues, greens, madder. Most importantly, a lavish use of gold, silver, and pearls. They brought that in. That was a real luxury and also a change in the color palette to the old manuscripts, the Buddhist manuscripts, the Jain miniatures, and also, as I told you, the pre-Mughal paintings of the Choropanchizika group, the Orcha paintings in particular. Then, about scale, I'll say that their forts and mausoleums became as lavish as the Nagar style temples and the Dravid temples. If you look at Brihadeshwara, or you go to the area of Tanjore, the huge temples they built there. But we never built palaces like that. And also, if you saw that in the Mauryan period, they built more with wood. Therefore, after the fire and over a period of time, we don't have much of the remains even of the Gupta period. The first temple we have is the brick temple at Bhitargaon, 4th century, made of brick, because the materials Indian used were not so permanent. The permanence came with the Greeks who came and to India, and the big battle which took place, the Alexander's battle, and they left behind people. So stone finished, so rock edicts started. But building actually started within the Indian context, I think in the 7th and 8th century, post-Gupta period. But the Mughals, what did they bring? They brought in these huge palaces, these huge forts. They brought in red brick. They brought in marble. If you look at the Taj Mahal, or it's all in white. BV Kamappara is all in white. You look at the Red Fort, it's red. You look at Sikandra, it's red. You look at Fatehpur Sikri, it's red sandstone. So they started using a lot of local material. They brought in their vision in the beginning, but the people who created were, as they say, Indian, local, Bhartiya people who created. It was their hands which made all the buildings, and the scale changed completely. You look at the Agra fort, you look at the Lal Killa here, compare it to the Purana Killa. The scale is absolutely different. And what the Mughals did, they brought in grandeur and splendor, which was not there before, pre-Mughal, if you see that. And the color palette was absolutely more vibrant. There were far more colors used. They also brought in a lot of use of precious and semi-precious stones. Their jewelry became fabulous. Look at the Nizam's jewels today from southern India. But if you look at the Mughals in North India, they used a lot of rubies, emeralds, diamonds, and pearls, which they brought from Basra, which they brought from wherever. And again, if you see their work, it was a great refinement. There was always, whatever they did, even their embroideries, whether it was Zardozi, what you saw in front was also equally good at the back. So when you look at the Jarrao jewelry which they made and you see the Meenakari at the back, that itself is so beautiful. You don't get to see that kind of work anymore. So when you look at the visual mapping of what the Mughals did with painting, with buildings and calligraphy, they took it to another level completely, which you see none of it exists anywhere in the world. When you come to this side of the Oxus River, the what you call Mughal, it's beautiful. When you look at the other side and you go towards Spain and the Ottoman Empire and Turkey, you see a different kind of visuality. But the refinement of the Mughals cannot be denied.
So we'll be closing this podcast for now, and next time we'll be talking about gods, kings, and unexpected patronage. Thank you, Dr. Pandey, for this conversation. This is quite a delight, and it's quite a great beginning, in fact, for starting this first episode with Mughals on Art Indica with Dr. Alka Pandey and Nidhesh. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.